Welcome back, everyone, to my podcast, Ancient Rome Today. I'm your host, Arohi, and I'm continuing with my mini-series on the legacy of poets in the Roman Republic. In this episode, I'll be talking about Gaius Valerius Catullus, known as simply Catullus. Poetry isn't for everyone. The poetry of ancient Greece and Rome is even less for everyone. Sometimes people get bored of hearing and telling the same stories about heroes, gods, titans, and monsters over and over again. What if you had a crush on someone you couldn't be with and wanted to resolve those feelings on paper? What if you got really angry at an acquaintance and wanted to write up an excellent speech tearing them to shreds? Then Catullus is the man for you. But what happens when you do all of that, and hundreds of years later, your poetry survives? Is breaking out of the box always celebrated? Listen on to hear about the lasting legacy of the poet himself, and whether we scholars always liked him this much. Catullus was born circa 84 BCE in an equestrian family in Verona. In my series on social classes in Rome, I go more into depth, but for new listeners, in a nutshell, equestrian families were generally wealthy and had a fair amount of social influence. He died circa 54 BCE. Despite living only about 30 years, Catullus' poetry had a long-lasting impact on poetry tradition in Rome and continues to be studied to this day. Catullus was part of a group of poets now called the Neoterics, who turned away from traditional classical poetry such as Homer, and wrote about differing topics in different styles. Indeed, Catullus himself wrote poems to friends, condolences, invectives, and erotic poems. The latter two categories include material that has actually historically been censored, and only recently allowed to come fully to light. While Catullus famously wrote about his attraction to and relationship with a woman with the pseudonym Lesbia, he also wrote homoerotic poems which were ill-received in more conservative societies of the past. In addition, Catullus wrote poems about erotic acts, sex, and sexual violence which were similarly censored and Baudelarized. I'll be drawing some help from this excellent article titled Shameful Kisses, A History of the Reception and Rejection of Homoeroticism in Catullus by Maxine Lewis and Christina Robertson of the University of Auckland. Focusing mostly on the reception of Catullus in Anglophone societies from 1659 to 1915, let us see how societal values influenced how people translated, read, and spread Catullus. Generally speaking, when faced with homoeroticism in Catullus's poems, translators and editors chose to either exclude sections or entire poems, Baudelarize words and phrases, or swap genders so that the relationship became heterosexual. Given that 12 of his roughly 116 surviving poems include material that is homoerotic or concerns male-male sexual violence, this is no small censorship of Catullus, no matter the manner. The poems include the homoerotic Juventius poems, poems about other men who express sexual desire towards men, and poems concerning threats or depictions of male-male sexual violence. Translators more often simply omitted the sexually violent poems, instead treating the homoerotic ones in different ways, according to the customs of their time. The first known English translation of a Juventius poem was in 1659, which actually was a close translation, including Juventius' name and not censoring the homoeroticism. However, the publication, by Richard Lovelace, used Latin in the title, which implies he meant it for a learned audience already interested in classics, not the general public. The next translation of Juventius' poems occurs in 1707, in an anonymous English translation of a French novelization of Catullus's life, called The Adventures of Catullus. In this translation, Juventius' name is kept, but an explanation is given. The narrator makes up a woman Crestinia, and says that due to her appearance resembling some other famous male named Juventius, she was given the nickname Juventius, and thus, Catullus's poem is actually to a woman, not a boy. This work included the first known instance of gender-swapping Juventius, and also was the largest bulk of Catullus' poems translated into English at that point. Per the authors, this meant that, quote, much of the Anglophone reception of Catullus was shaped by a racy work of French fanfiction, end quote. Whereas previously, most questionable content regarding male-male relationships was simply omitted, by the late 18th century, a culture of complete translations arose. This meant that the first work to include all of Catullus's poems was published in 1795 by John Knott. However, Knott still had a concern about the material, and assured his readers he did not, quote, overstep the modesty of language, end quote. He does not name Uentius, though does keep his name in the Latin on the facing page. He also obscures content such as the concubinus or slave boy in poem 61 by addressing the poem directly as thou. Finally, in the obscene poems, Knott uses euphemisms for opposite-sex obscenity, but fully censors the same-sex obscenities, opting instead to only give vague ideas about the matter. Those who could read Latin would have been able to understand the poem uncensored, but those who could not were forced to accept what Knott gave. The first Victorian translation comes in 1861 by Martin. He included only 76 poems, reordering them and focusing them on Lesbia. While he includes 2 of the Uentius poems, he does not name Uentius in poem 48 and swaps the gender for poem 99. In poem 61, he simply omits the lines with same-sex content. For poem 11 and the infamous poem 16, he severely tones down the language. It is important to note that this translation appears to have been aimed at an upper class that already knew Latin. Therefore, though it is heavily censored, its impact is not large. This changes with Kelly's 1854 translation, which was, quote, aimed at a mass audience which was reading for self-improvement, including both the middle and working classes, end quote. Kelly does not include every poem, and calls the poems concerning same-sex material representative of, quote, vices of the age, end quote. He censored Catullus's work inconsistently. At some times, he obscures gender while keeping Uentius' name, while at other times he obscures both gender and name. However, he keeps both in poem 81. Occasionally, Kelly provided a French translation of some of the more objectionable material, but only upper-class, well-educated audiences would have been able to read this. Finally, the explicit Latin is either redacted or its meaning utterly reduced. In contrast, Ellis, 1871, and Hart Davies, 1879, produced translations that included more of the non-obscene same-sex content, such as keeping the correct genders for the Uentius poems, as well as for the concubinus in 61. Moving out of the Victorian age, the last heavily censored translation of Catullus comes in 1915 from Mary Stuart, who aimed her volume at a general audience. The first woman to translate a volume of Catullus, Stuart was also a suffragist. However, her progressive thinking did not extend to same-sex relations or obscenity of any kind. She changed Uentius' name to Lesbia's in poems 48 and 99, and expurgated all obscenities, whether same or opposite sex. In doing so, she, quote, out-Victorianed, end quote, her predecessors. In 1915, W.B. Yeats wrote The Scholars, rejecting all censorship of Catullus and paving the way for explicit and faithful translation of all of Catullus' same-sex and obscene material. But in our journey through the centuries from 1659 to 1915, we have seen how different ways of thinking lead to different methods of censorship of art. From swapping genders or changing names, to outright omission, the way in which Catullus was treated ought to make us think about how art is presented to us, and how our own biases affect the way we interact with it. It is our duty to take lessons from scholars of years past and ensure our descendants deserve to have faithful and true access to it. Poetry might not be for everyone, but for those whom it is, why should we prevent it from being understood?